Part 5, Chapter 3. Throughout the night, the successive watchmen kept a close watch for a break in the weather. It came during the very early morning hours. The wind moderated considerably. Shackleton was immediately notified, and he ordered that all hands be called at the first streak of light. The men were turned out just before 6 a.m. McNeish went to work putting the finishing touches on the Caird's canvas decking, while Green and Ordley's began to render some blubber into oil to be poured on the sea in the event that they had to heave to because of extremely bad weather. Others collected stores and equipment for the boat. The Caird party was to take a 6 weeks' supply of food, consisting of 3 cases of scrupulously hoarded sledging ration, 2 cases of nut food, a supply of biscuits, and powdered milk in bouillon cubes to provide the party with hot drinks. The cooking would be done on a Primus stove, and 2 were to be taken so they would have a spare. What little extra clothing could be found in the way of socks and mittens was rounded up, along with 6 of the reindeer's sleeping bags. For equipment, the Caird could carry 1 pair of binoculars, a prismatic compass, a small medicine chest originally intended for its sledging party, 4 oars, a bailer, the pump that Hurley had made, a shotgun and some shells, a sea anchor, and a fishing line, plus a few candles and a supply of matches. Worsley had gathered together all the navigational aids he could find. He took his own sextant and another which belonged to Hudson, along with the necessary navigational tables and what charts were to be had. These were packed into a box that was made as watertight as possible. He still carried his sole chronometer slung around his neck. Out of 24 on board, the Endurance, when she sailed from England, this one alone had survived. A farewell breakfast was prepared, for which Shackleton permitted 2 extra biscuits and a 1/4 pound of jam per man. For the most part, the men stood around joking. McCarthy was admonished by the other forecastle hands not to get his feet wet during the voyage. Worsley was cautioned against overheating when he reached civilization, and Crane was forced to promise that he would leave some girls for the rest of the party after they were rescued. But the tension in the air was unmistakable. Both groups knew they might never see one another again. Shortly after breakfast, the sun came out. Worsley grabbed his sextant and quickly obtained a sight, which, when he had worked it out, proved his chronometer to be fairly accurate. He seemed like a lucky omen. Toward 9 o'clock, Shackleton went with Worsley up the lookout point to survey the ice conditions offshore. They saw a band of floes parallel to the coast about 6 miles out, but there was an opening through which the Caird could pass easily. They returned to camp and found that McNeish was finished and the boat was ready. Under the circumstances, McNeish had done a magnificent job. The entire boat was decked over with canvas, except for an open hatchway aft that was about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. Yoke lines, like reins, ran back to the rudder for steering. So far as appearances went, she looked seaworthy enough. All hands were mustered to launch her. She was lying with her stern toward the sea, and there was a long line attached to her bow. The men tried to shove her off the beach, but the heavy volcanic grit at the shoreline held her fast. Marston, Greenstreet, Ordley's, and Kerr waded into the icy surf up to their knees, and with the rest of the men shoving, attempted to rock her free. She still refused to move. Wild tried to pry her bow free, using an oar as a lever, while all hands pushed. But the oar broke, and the boat was fast as ever. The Caird's crew, except for Shackleton, scrambled on board in the hope of pulling her off with oars. As they did so, a large wave broke on the beach, and she rode out on its backwash into deeper water. The moment she was afloat, the weight of the 5 men sitting on the decking made her top-heavy, and she rolled heavily to port. Vincent and McNeish were thrown into the sea. Both men made their way ashore, cursing furiously. Vincent traded with Howe for a semi-dry pair of underwear and trousers, but McNeish refused to exchange clothes with anybody and climbed back on board with the boat. The Caird was then paddled out past the reef, and she waited at the end of her bow line while the Wills was launched and loaded with about half a ton of ballast. This cargo was rowed out and transferred to the Caird. On her second trip, the Wills took out another quarter ton of ballast sacks and an extra 500 pounds of large rocks. Shackleton was now ready to go. He had spoken to Wild for the last time, and the two had shaken hands. The provisions were placed on board the Wills, and Shackleton and Vincent climbed aboard, and she pulled away from the beach. "Good luck, boss," the shore party called after him. Shackleton swung around and waved briefly. When they reached the Caird, Shackleton and Vincent jumped on board, and the stores were rapidly passed across. The Wills then returned for her final load, the two 18-gallon casks of water and several pieces of ice, weighing perhaps 125 pounds altogether, which were intended to supplement the boat's supply of water. Because of their weight, the casks were made fast astern of the Wills, and she towed them out. But just as she was clearing the reef, a huge swell rose beneath her and swung her broadside to the surf. She got across, but one of the water casks was torn loose and went drifting toward the beach. The Wills quickly delivered her load and went after the stray water cask. She picked it up just as it was about to wash up on the beach and returned with it to the Caird. For a few minutes, the two boats lay alongside one another, bumping heavily. Shackleton was terribly anxious to get away, and he was urgently directing the stowage of ballast and equipment. Finally, the two crews leaned across and shook hands. Again, there were several nervous jokes. Then the Wills let go and headed for the beach. It was just 12:30. The three little sails on the Caird were up when the men ashore saw McCarthy in the bow signaling to cast off the bow line. Wild let go of it, and McCarthy hauled it in. The party on shore gave 3 cheers, and across the surging breakers, they heard 3 small shouts in reply. The Caird caught the wind, and Worsley at the helm swung her bow toward the north. They made surprising speed for such a small craft, Ortlies recorded. We watched them until they were out of sight, which was not long, for such a tiny boat was soon lost to sight on the great heaving ocean. As she dipped into the trough of each wave, she disappeared completely, sail and all.